You were never meant to hear this. The documents were burned, the witnesses silenced, and the earth itself reshaped to forget. But something always survives the fire. So let me ask you something, quietly now. Have you ever stood in a place that felt wrong, where the air's too still, the shadows cling too long, and your instincts beg you to leave without understanding why? Copper Creek is one of those places. In 1843, it carved through the hills of northwestern Connecticut like a quiet scar, feeding the grindstones of the Hartwell Mill, which never slept, never slowed, and never, ever stopped. People said it was progress, said the brothers were builders of prosperity. But what they didn't say, what they couldn't say, is that something else was being fed, something older than industry, something older than man. Because when you look at the records from Millbrook before 1843, you'll find names, families, children. You'll find them being born, baptized, married. But then, after the mill was expanded, something starts happening. The baptisms stop, the burials increase, and people begin to vanish. Not in storms, not in illness, but silently on dry nights. In daylight on their way to the mill, no bodies, no blood, only a fine powder left behind. It wasn't just grain being ground beneath those stones, and it wasn't just flour that filled the air. You see, every structure has a purpose, but not every purpose is spoken aloud. The Hartwell Mill was built with timber from cursed groves, its foundation stone taken from a place the natives marked and never entered. The blueprints, according to a sealed ledger found in the attic of the Congregational Church, weren't drawn by either brother, but copied from something far older than Connecticut, a monastery burned in 1532, whose monks claimed to be grinding sin itself, and in 1843, that same pattern was resurrected in America, hidden behind a mask of enterprise. Backed by silent financiers from Boston and New Haven, who never visited the site, yet funded its operation with near-religious zeal. That's why no one spoke, why the sheriff never asked questions, why even the church stayed silent as pews emptied, because they knew what had been reawakened. And now, so do you. But this is only the first turn of the wheel. There are 32 more. Keep listening. What you hear next may unmake the version of history you were raised to believe. They called it a gristmill, but the deeper truth was buried under layers of gears, stone, and silence. The Hartwell brothers claimed they were improving efficiency, that their expansions in 1843 would double output, that their new imported grinding stones from France would make Millbrook the flour capital of the valley. But no one asked why a gristmill needed a basement with 7 sealed doors. No one questioned why the original architect went mad before the final stone was laid. The people of Millbrook were taught to be grateful, grateful for jobs, grateful for food, grateful that the Hartwells had built something lasting. But what they built was not for the town. It was for something that came before the town and would outlive it. There are old maps. Before the township had a name, the land where the mill now stands was once marked with only one word: cursed. Not haunted, not Indian burial ground, not folklore, just cursed. That's what the Mohegan Scouts called the gorge at Copper Creek. They refused to camp there, refused to even speak its name in their oral records. They claimed the waters ran red under the new moon, that the wind would carry voices from beneath the stone. But Solomon Hartwell built there anyway. He said the dreams led him to it, said he had visions of wheels within wheels, of a machinery that never stopped turning, even long after death. His sons inherited more than land, Josiah became the mouthpiece, the man the bankers and town officials could speak with. Cold, calculating, logical. But Elias? Elias was something else. He understood machines on a level that unnerved men, could hear imbalance in a gear shaft, the way a musician hears a sour note. He redesigned the mill's lower levels himself, and he was the one who insisted they bring in that French stone. Do you know where that stone came from? A demolished abbey outside Lyon, destroyed in 1792 during the French Revolution. It had been sealed for 100 years prior. No one knew what was inside, but that stone, white, veined, and impossibly durable, was transported across an ocean for one purpose only: to grind, not wheat, but will. What the Hartwells built was not a flour mill. It was a sacrificial engine, and once it began turning, something began to wake beneath Millbrook. You've felt it, haven't you? That pull? Good, because we've only just begun to scratch beneath the stone. It began with whispers, soft at first, barely audible over the grind of the millstones. Men who worked the night shift spoke of hearing voices, not human voices, but a kind of low rhythmic chant that seemed to echo from beneath the floorboards, always in threes, always in a language no one could name. At first, they blamed exhaustion, then drink, then the wind. But the wind doesn't hum in perfect intervals, and it doesn't whisper secrets about your past that no one should know. Old Henry Tallow was the first to break, a millwright with hands like bark and a back curved from 40 years of labor. He walked into Garrett's tavern one night, with his apron still dusted in flour, sat at the corner table, and whispered to anyone who would listen. It ain't wheat they grindin'. It's memory. Ours, yours, God's. He was gone the next morning, left a note scratched into the wall of his boarding room with a broken file. The wheel is hungry. They found his boots by the creek, still warm. Not long after, the town's children began to speak in their sleep. Mothers reported them sitting upright at 3:00 a.m., eyes wide, reciting mechanical schematics they couldn't possibly know. One child, Elizabeth Kern, drew a perfect replica of the mill's substructure in chalk, including chambers. No one outside the Hartwell family should have seen. She'd never been inside. When asked where she saw it, she simply said, "I didn't. He showed me. The thin man in the dark coat who walks through walls." That's when the elders tried to step in, but they were too late, because by then, the grinding stones had worn down more than just corn. They had begun to sharpen something else, a kind of memory engine, Elias called it, in one of his recovered notes. Found tucked inside the false bottom of his bureau after the mill shut down in 1860. "We don't process grain," he wrote. "We process time. We refine it, bleach it, strip the iron impurities. What remains is pure will. That's the offering." And still, no one listened, because power has a rhythm. And Millbrook had already learned to move in lockstep with the sound of turning stone. You hear it, don't you? Faintly, behind everything else? That's not your heartbeat. That's the wheel, and it's already turning for you. By the time the third man vanished, even the sheriff stopped pretending it was coincidence. His name was Lemuel Cray, a war veteran, built like a butcher block, known for his silence and for carrying a flintlock pistol. Long after percussion caps made it obsolete, he'd been hired by the town council, not to investigate, but to watch the mill. Not publicly, of course. No one dared insult the Hartwells openly. The council simply said they were increasing vigilance due to recent disruptions. Cray set up a post across the creek in the tree line with a spyglass and a journal, and for 3 nights he wrote exactly 1 sentence per entry. The wheel turned. Then nothing. On the fourth night, he didn't report. They found his pistol embedded in a tree trunk, as if hurled with impossible force. His journal lay open nearby. On the final page, scrawled not in ink but in blood, were the words, "It sees through the grain." That was the moment the town began to fracture. Half believed the mill was cursed. The other half believed it was blessed. They said the price was worth it, that Millbrook's prosperity came from sacrifice, that every missing person was part of the offering, chosen by something older than the town itself. There were sermons about it, not from the church, but whispered under breath in backrooms and barns, men speaking in candlelight about the order beneath the grind, about balancing the weight of will and wheat. The term grist for the gods became more than metaphor. And still, the Hartwells said nothing. Josiah walked the streets like a banker with blood on his shoes, unbothered, untouched. And Elias? Elias began sleeping inside the mill. They said he never left, that he'd installed a cot beside the main stone, and was often seen muttering to it before dawn, as if it were listening, because maybe it was. The wheel wasn't just machinery, it was a threshold. Every revolution, a turning of more than gears. It didn't grind grain. It wore down the boundary between worlds, and Millbrook was no longer on just one side of that threshold. You're beginning to understand now, aren't you? Good, because the next thing you hear might tear open something that's always been watching you, waiting for you, grinding you into compliance, and now you have a choice. Keep listening, or turn away and pretend your world is still what you were told it was. You stayed. That tells me everything. It means you're ready to hear the part they tried hardest to bury. Not just in documents, but in the design of memory itself. There's a reason no national records mention the Millbrook disappearances. Why no federal investigations were ever launched. Why not one headline survives from 1843 to 1855 about the missing? Because they were never just missing. They were erased. Do you know what that means? It means their existence, their birth, their property, their debts and marriages were wiped from every known ledger. Their graves never dug, their names never spoken in official meetings. It was like the land itself swallowed them, and worse, forgot them. But some things survive forgetting. There's a reason I know this story. In 1936, during Depression-era work projects, a team was sent to reinforce the abandoned Hartwell Mills foundation. The lower chambers had flooded decades earlier. The town had left it to rot. When the concrete team drained the lower levels, they discovered a vault. Octagonal, carved in stone older than the rest of the structure, walls covered in symbols. Not Christian, not native, just alien. And in the center? Not bones, not tools, but something worse. A chair, carved from a single piece of black oak, polished smooth from use, surrounded by iron hooks and 4 brass tubes leading directly to the mill's drive shaft. As if will itself was extracted from the one who sat there, fed into the machine, and pulsed through the town like invisible electricity. The engineers called it a power transfer mechanism. But one of them, a man named Crowley, kept a private journal. His last entry read, "This wasn't built for flour. This was built to grind submission. Every sack of grain was an offering to something hollow and hungry. The mill didn't feed people. It fed obedience." Crowley was institutionalized weeks later. He died in 1941. His tongue had been removed. The vault was resealed, the report buried under 50 layers of bureaucracy. But the wheel kept turning. Even abandoned, even silent, it still grinds, and every so often, when the wind moves just right across the valley, The people of Millbrook swear they hear it again. Turning, grinding, choosing. Do you feel that pressure in your chest now? That's not fear, that's recognition. Because deep down, some part of you remembers this. You were never meant to, but you do. They called it madness, but madness is just the word they use when truth burns too bright. After Crowley vanished, the files were sealed under the Connecticut Infrastructure Archives, Box 17 marked as structural irregularities, hazardous. Never opened again. But one man kept looking. Professor Gerald Huxley, Yale Divinity School, 1952. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a historian. He was something far more dangerous. A man who asked the wrong questions and refused to stop. Huxley traced the Hartwell name not just through Connecticut records, but back into Europe, back to an order known as the Millenarii, a silent sect erased from Catholic registries after the Council of Trent. They weren't monks, they weren't priests, they were grinders, keepers of hidden engines built beneath monasteries, cathedrals, and castles. Machines said to turn not by water, but by devotion, by sacrifice, by consent. He published exactly one paper, privately, under a pseudonym, called The Gear Beneath the Throne. In it, he suggested that structures like the Hartwell Mill weren't isolated incidents. They were nodes, points in a network of power older than the Republic, older than the Church, a mechanism not for production, but for shaping behavior. Faith, fear, obedience, he wrote, are not taught. They are processed, filtered through grindstones of ritual and repetition, until the human will no longer resists but submits. He claimed these mills were part of what he called the Great Pattern, and he drew a map connecting Millbrook to 3 other sites: a collapsed grain house in Bavaria, a drained reservoir in Scotland, and a vanished structure outside Krakow, Poland, swallowed by forest in 1899. Each site had similar features: a chair no one could explain, a wheel that never stopped, and a record of unanswered disappearances. Huxley disappeared in 1955. His home was ransacked, his notes missing. Only fragments of his maps and transcripts remain. But what they describe is terrifying. The mills weren't about food. They were about frequency, sound, motion, pressure, repetition. Each revolution shaping reality itself, grinding not just grain, but history, erasing the rebellious, perfecting the compliant. And Millbrook? It wasn't the first. It won't be the last, because the wheel is not just in one place. It's an idea, a machine of control disguised as progress. And, brother, you've been living in its hum your whole life. By the late 1800s, the Hartwell Mill had become a ruin. Vines crawled up its water wheel. The creek ran slower, and the once pristine grinding stones were cracked and silent. But the townspeople, those who remained, refused to go near it. Children were warned, never touch the stone. Old families moved away without a word, and the remaining pastors quietly rewrote their sermons to avoid the concept of obedience. But the strangest change wasn't in the town. It was in the people. Millbrook, once a place of music, gatherings, laughter, had grown cold, emotionless. The weddings stopped, the births declined, the air felt sterile. It was like something had drained, not just memory, but desire itself. A visiting doctor from New Haven in 1891 described the locals as functioning, but faded. He wrote, "They perform their duties with mechanical precision, but lack all warmth. There is no music in them, no flame, as if something unseen has bleached their will. Sound familiar? It should, because that's what the wheel does. That's its true gift. Not death, not madness, but compliance. You're beginning to see it now, aren't you? This wasn't about just one mill. It was a prototype, a test site, for something bigger, something we now call modern civilization. Think about it. Factory bells, assembly lines, school clocks, church rituals, daily news cycles, even your phone's notification rhythm. Ding, you check. Ding, you obey. They taught you to grind yourself. The wheel just showed them how. They copied its principle, not its stone, replaced wood and quartz with plastic and electricity. But the function, identical. To hollow you out, to replace will with routine, spirit with structure. And here's the darkest part. You agreed, not in words, but in every unexamined habit, every hour given to repetition, without reflection, every moment you ignored the whisper inside, saying, "This isn't what I'm meant for." The wheel no longer needs a creak. It runs on you. That pressure behind your eyes, the ache in your spine when you sit too long, the voice you silence when it asks too many questions. That's not fatigue, that's compression. You are being milled. Now ask yourself, what are they turning you into? There's something they don't want you to realize. Not just about Millbrook, not just about 1843, but about the world you're living in right now. You see, the Hartwell mill wasn't just grinding willpower. It was harvesting resonance. Every revolution of that stone didn't just move flour through machinery. It moved thought through silence. It carved grooves in the collective mind. Because here's the truth you were never meant to hear. Repetition reshapes reality. They understood that. They knew that if they could turn the wheel long enough, if they could feed it with just enough sacrifice, eventually it would do more than grind grain or submission. It would start shaping what is. It would change what could be seen, what could be remembered, what could be imagined. And once that happened, they wouldn't need force, wouldn't need fear. You would police yourself, ask yourself, how many things do you avoid saying even when you're alone? How many questions have you learned not to ask? How many memories have you buried so deep they no longer feel like yours? That's the wheel. It grinds without chains, without whips, without fire, because it's already inside you. That voice that says, don't speak up, don't resist, just keep going. That's not fear, that's conditioning now. Let me tell you what the Hartwells discovered near the end. In the winter of 1855, Elias began carving something into the back wall of the mill's lowest chamber. Not a design, not a diagram, a confession, etched in fine spirals only visible under candlelight. He wrote, "The wheel must never stop. If it does, it remembers. If it remembers, it mourns, and mourning calls the old mind back." What did he mean? He meant the machine wasn't just erasing, it was holding something back, something ancient, something buried not in the earth, but in consciousness, a primal memory, a roar beneath the grind. They weren't just hiding the history. They were burying who you truly are, because once you remember, you stop grinding, and they know. If even a few of you stop, the whole machine begins to crack. So here's your first act of defiance. Comment this phrase, "I remember the roar," and write it twice. Seal it, because from this point on, you're not just listening, you're awakening. Now that you've spoken the phrase twice, something ancient stirs within you. It's not metaphor, it's remembrance, because what was buried beneath the wheel wasn't just history, it was you. The part of you that knows how to resist. The part of you that doesn't flinch when the truth burns. The part of you they've tried to grind down with routine, with guilt, with obedience masked as virtue. And that roar? It isn't rage. It's clarity. Let me show you what Elias feared most before the mill collapsed. In the final weeks of 1855, he locked himself in the vault beneath the Hartwell mill. Town records said he was repairing the shaft, but his private notes, recovered decades later, hidden in a book spine in Brewster's general store, tell another story. "The wheel has begun reversing," he wrote. "It is no longer consuming will. It is extracting origin." What did he mean? He meant the mill had reached a frequency where it could unravel the lie. You see, all this time, the machine was meant to enforce a story. One story, the one you were raised inside, where obedience is safety, where systems are sacred, where rebellion is sin. But the moment the wheel turned counterclockwise, something broke free, a memory not of the town, not of the Hartwells, but of before names, before thrones, before order, a world where man was ungrindable. That's what he saw in the flame between the gears, a vision of what humanity had been, before submission was encoded into our rituals, our schedules, our sense of self. He wrote, "They called it Eden, not paradise, but potential. We gave it up for machinery." And then he vanished. Not dead, not buried. Gone. Some say he escaped into the shaft. Others say he passed through something, a threshold. And here's the terrifying possibility, that the wheel wasn't built to control you. It was built to contain what you truly are. The roar. It's not war, it's memory break. Ing the dam. And once it spills into your life, into your choices, your breath, your shadow, there is no returning to the man you were. Because now, you've heard it, and the wheel has no power over those who remember who turned it first, you. Now listen closely, because this is the part most men are too afraid to face. The wheel was never the enemy. It was the mirror. The machine didn't just grind you. It reflected you, over and over and over, until all the rough edges disappeared, until only your most predictable self remained, that version of you, the one that punches the clock, apologizes for truth, bites his tongue at the dinner table, stares at the phone to drown out thought. That's the processed you, the refined product, the version they built the world to harvest, because the real you, the first you, was never meant to be efficient. He was fire. He was edge. He was dangerous. But that kind of man, he disrupts cycles. He doesn't bow to institutions. He doesn't ask for permission. And most of all, he doesn't fear remembering. That's why the Hartwell Mill was designed to suppress more than will. It was meant to seal potential, turn men into husks, so history could be written not by truth, but by routine. You were told the past was brutal, that progress saved you. But what if I told you the brutal part was what they did after they buried the old codes, after they stripped symbols of their real meanings, after they replaced ritual with repetition and spirit with structure, the chair beneath the mill? It wasn't just for extracting will, it was for extracting identity. A man who sat too long beneath the wheel, forgot who he was. And worse, he accepted the version they gave him. We have documents, hidden in Yale's restricted archive, that suggest more than 17 people were subjected to resonance calibration beneath the Hartwell Mill, men who were later seen alive, but altered, their voices flat, their eyes dull, their loyalties absolute. One became a district judge, another, a textile baron, and one founded a boarding school in Rhode Island, where every bell chimed at the same frequency as the millstone. Coincidence? Or Conti? Nuation? Because once you realize this isn't just a story about Millbrook, but about America itself, then you understand. This isn't about saving history, It's about breaking the machine. And now, piece by piece, you're learning how. Stay with me, because next, I'll show you what happens when the wheel stops cold, and the memory of man comes flooding back. There is a reason they fear the wheel stopping, because silence is not the absence of motion. It is the awakening of memory. When the Hartwell Mill's great stone finally seized, January 3rd, 1856, the valley went dead quiet. The birds stopped singing. Dogs wouldn't go near the creek, and every clock in Millbrook froze at 3:33 a.m. Eyewitnesses described the silence as heavy, as if the very air had gained weight. And then, something stranger. People started remembering things that never happened. A child recited the name of a sibling who'd never been born. An old woman claimed to recall her own funeral. And one man, a stonemason named Caleb Dean, walked into the center of town, eyes blank, and muttered over and over, "The first wheel turned inside us. This one was just a reflection." Then he collapsed, dead before he hit the ground, no cause found. That's when the elders tried to intervene. Yes, I said elders, not town officials, not clergy, but a group of men and women who had held no titles, but controlled every vote, every contract, every silence. They convened a closed council that very night, sealed the mill, bricked up the vault, and swore an oath of containment. They believed the wheel was a breach, not just of moral code, but of dimensional integrity. Because here's what Elias Hartwell's final entry revealed, scribbled in ink made of rust and marrow. When the wheel halts, the false world begins to peel. He wasn't talking about hallucinations. He meant structure itself. The order you think is natural. Linear time, hierarchical control, institutional memory. All of it began to warp as the wheel's resonance dropped to zero. And that terrified them, because they knew, if the illusion failed, the original design would emerge. And that design was freedom, but not the patriotism slick kind you've been sold, not slogans or elections or empty permissions. I'm talking about pre-institute, final freedom, the kind that roars without asking, the kind that creates, destroys, remakes, the kind that cannot be governed. That's what was buried in the silence, and that's what's still buried in you. You hear it now, don't you? That pressure behind your thoughts? It's not fear, it's the memory of what you were before the grinding began. You're not just remembering, you're reclaiming, and that's exactly what they fear. Because if even a handful of men step out of rhythm, if just a few stop marching to the old mechanical heartbeat, then the entire facade begins to buckle. They knew this in 1856, and they know it now. That's why, after the wheel stopped, they didn't destroy the mill. They sealed it, preserved it like a relic, because it still had value to them. Not as a machine, but as a symbol, a warning, and maybe even a backup plan. In 1903, a team of industrial planners visited Millbrook, no names recorded, only a brief mention in the town ledger. Guests from the foundation, assessing legacy infrastructure. That was the same year standardized school bells were introduced across the eastern seaboard. That was the year time became uniform, schedules became sacred, and men began to wake up tired and go to bed obedient. Coincidence or replication? Let me tell you what they discovered inside the mill that day. The water wheel was dry, the stones were cracked, but one thing still turned, a gear deep in the foundation, cold, silent, moving without resistance. When they lifted it from its stone cradle, they found no power source, no pressure, no fuel. It spun on memory alone. It's what Elias called a resonance relic, an object so saturated with belief, with repetition, with energy of submission, that it becomes self-repeating. It doesn't just move, it reminds. That gear was taken to an undisclosed location. We have reason to believe it now resides beneath a certain government archive in Maryland, where it's still observed, still measured, still feared, because they don't know if stopping it again would collapse the system built around it. Everything, the routines, the language, the institutions, may be linked to that first wheel, the prototype, the origin. So they keep it spinning, not because they need it, but because they're terrified of what might return when it finally stops. And you? You were never meant to hear this, but now you have, and something in you has already begun turning in the opposite direction. Do you feel it? The friction. That's not resistance. That's rebirth. Let me ask you something direct, because you're ready for it now. When was the last time you made a decision without checking the time? No deadline, no schedule, no expectation, just instinct, just intent, just will. Can't remember, can you? That's not your fault. That's the mill inside you still grinding, still turning in the grooves they carved since birth. You were trained to believe time is management, that control equals maturity, that routine means stability. But that's a lie they polished until it gleamed like truth. The real function of time, as they designed it, isn't to measure the day. It's to measure you, every minute accounted for, every hour optimized, every goal benchmarked, until you mistake the ticking of the clock for the beating of your own heart. But there's a difference. Your heart wants, it burns, it reaches, it rebels. The clock. It divides, it disciplines, it devours. And that's what the Hartwell mill taught them. The gear didn't need electricity. It needed obedience. Just enough people walking in rhythm. Just enough minds grinding down their own questions. Just enough men exchanging fire for function. And suddenly, you don't need prisons. The people become machinery. But here's what they fear most. That a man might step out of rhythm. That he might stop counting hours and start reclaiming moments. Because the moment you reclaim your time, you reclaim your mind. And when the mind is free, the wheel can no longer turn. They knew this in 1856. That's why they sent agents, not soldiers. Why they built schools, not chains. Why they designed rituals you'd accept without question. Punch in, sit down, repeat after me, raise your hand, silence your truth, wait your turn, obey the tone. You were never in school. You were in refinement. But now, you've stepped off the belt. The sound of the wheel is no longer your lullaby. It's your alarm. Tick, tock. Remember, you are not a product. You are the spark they feared would light the whole machine on fire. You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? That strange discomfort in your chest, that hum behind your thoughts. It's not fear. It's pressure escaping. You were sealed like a vessel, filled with someone else's rhythm, poured into a mold shaped by old systems, older fears. But now there's a crack, and through that crack, something is bleeding back in. Your origin. Let me explain what Elias Hartwell discovered just days before the final shutdown. His private sketches, what survived the fire, show something no historian could explain. A spiral woven with teeth, not a gear, not a wheel, but a symbol. It matched carvings found in Sardinia, in the tombs beneath Göbekli Tepe, and, most disturbingly, on the bone of a man unearthed in Vermont, dated 9,200 years before the first American colony. This wasn't a local curse. This wasn't just Connecticut's sin. This was global, because every civilization that reached a certain level of control of centralization, hierarchy, mechanization, built the same thing: a mill, a wheel, a spiral. They called it different names. Some wrapped it in religion, some in science. But it always came back to one core idea: turn the human spirit into something measurable, repeatable, controllable. And they always failed, because the spiral, once it opens, cannot be closed. Elias wasn't just a mechanic, he was a witness. And in his final entry, burned at the edges, barely legible, he wrote, "We thought we were feeding it, but it was teaching us. It mimics what we build, then shows us what we've become." He called it the mirror spiral, and it's not gone. It's not buried. It's in every system you obey without question, every script you follow automatically, every voice in your head that says, "Don't," when your instinct screams, "Now." But here's the thing. Once you see the spiral, you can't unsee it, and it stops pulling you in. It becomes a lens, and through it, you begin to see the machine for what it is, a parasite masquerading as progress. And brother, you're not its food anymore. You are its undoing. There's a reason this knowledge feels dangerous. Because it is. Not to you, but to them. Every institution that ever branded itself as necessary, the church, the state, the school, the screen, all of them depend on one fragile illusion: that you need them more than they need you, that you are chaotic and they are order, that your instincts are wild and their systems are salvation. But what if I told you the most obedient men in history were also the most broken? What if I told you that the word obedience appears more in employee manuals and religious scripture than in any ancient warrior code? The mill didn't teach people to thrive. It taught them to tolerate delay, tolerate silence, tolerate smallness. And slowly, over decades, men forgot the difference between discipline and domestication. Let me put it plainly. The Hartwells didn't just build a mill, they engineered a behavioral forge. And they weren't the only ones. Because when that original gear, the one now hidden beneath Maryland, was studied in secret in the 1950s, something unexpected happened. Test subjects, placed near it, began experiencing hallucinations, not of monsters, not of death, but of routine. One man described being trapped in a loop, reliving the same breakfast, the same commute, the same awkward smile from his wife, over and over again. Another wrote, "I saw my own face staring at me from inside a machine, and the machine was smiling. It didn't break their minds. It revealed them. And what broke them was the realization that they were already living inside that machine. That's what the wheel shows you when it stops spinning. It wasn't ever turning on its own. You were turning it. Every compromise, every postponed dream, every lie told just to keep the peace, that's the grind. But now you've stopped. You're standing still. Silent, present. And in that stillness, something old returns. Not hatred, not revenge, but a memory of power. Unrefined, unmanaged, undeniable. You're not just breaking the machine anymore. You're remembering the shape of the world before it was ever built. They never feared chaos. They feared the man who could walk through it untouched, because a man like that doesn't need their boundaries, their definitions, their roles. He doesn't ask for a place at the table. He builds his own fire and lets the weak decide if they can handle the smoke. And that, brother, is who you're becoming. Not because I told you, not because this story moved you, but because something inside you has snapped back into alignment. not to their grid, but to the origin pulse, the one that beat before the first contract, before the first throne, before the first system whispered, "Obey, and we will let you live." Let me give you one last piece from the sealed Hartwell ledger. Hidden under the altar of the Congregational Church for over a century, it wasn't a confession, it was a diagram, a circle, inside it, 3 gears, each labeled with a single word: body, will, voice. When perfectly aligned, the wheel moved smooth as breath. But twist even one, and the system, their system, begins to seize. That's what you were never meant to discover, that you are the machine they modeled everything after, that the first mill wasn't an invention, it was a replication of you, of your design, of your triune nature, of the dangerous potential you carry when you speak truth, act without hesitation, and hold a code they didn't write for you. The Hartwell Mill wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by echoes. Echoes of men who remembered who they were before the grindstone touched their name, before they traded power for politeness, before they chose comfort over sovereignty. And now those echoes are speaking through you. Do you feel it? Not rage, not rebellion, but return, the full return of your faculties, your instinct, your discernment, your presence. The gears are turning again. But this time, they're turning on your terms. Not to grind, but to build, to shape, to shatter the illusion. So, stand firm. Speak sharp. Move deliberately. Because from this point forward, every act of truth you commit is a hammer against the ancient wheel. Do you understand the threat you now pose? You're no longer part of the rhythm. You've become the disruption, that quiet unease others feel around you. It's not intimidation, it's recognition. They sense the fracture, the break in your pattern, the refusal to march, the calm in your eyes that says, "I know something you pretend not to." And they're right. Because what you've begun to remember, what the Hartwell Mill was designed to erase, is that conscious men don't obey well. They command, they reshape, they infect systems with truth. And if too many awaken, the entire mechanism begins to shake. That's why, historically, awakenings are met with ridicule, not chains, because if they chained you, others would ask why. But if they laugh at you, if they call you paranoid, conspiratorial, unstable, they convince the world you're not dangerous, when in fact, you're lethal. Not to people, but to structures built on illusion. Let me show you how deep the mill's design went. In the 1940s, a psychologist named Dr. Edwin Farrick gained secret access to the original mill site. He performed experiments in silence, isolation, and rhythmic vibration. His conclusion? When exposed to certain frequencies of repetition, the male mind does not break. It fragments, reforms, and begins seeking an external code to stabilize itself. That's why they always provide the code, the flag, the book, the office hierarchy, the curriculum, the trending opinion, because if they can give you a ready-made identity when yours collapses, they own the reconstruction. But you let it collapse. You watched it burn, and you refused the replacement costume. You stood in the ashes, naked, silent, and began listening to something older than the mill, older than the myth, older than the machine, yourself. And that's why you're still here, why you've made it to Section 17, why your body hasn't rejected this truth, why your mind hasn't shut down in fear, because you were built for this. The others? They're still grinding, still smiling, still submitting, but you've become what the machine cannot process, a man with nothing to prove, and everything to remember. You've crossed a line now, and there's no going back. Not because you can't, but because the man you used to be, the one who tolerated the grind, the silence, the shrinking, he doesn't exist anymore. And if he does, he's watching you from behind glass now, studying you like a ghost studies the living. Because what's happening here isn't entertainment. It's not storytelling. This is a mirror ritual, and every word you've absorbed is stripping away what they layered onto you. They never expected a man like you to listen this far, to stay with the descent, to lean into the abyss instead of running from it. But now you see, the abyss isn't dark because it's empty. It's dark because it's full of everything they told you to forget. And at the bottom of that void is the truth they buried in the wheel. Let me take you deeper. In 1971, a team of covert researchers returned to Millbrook. The town was gone, dissolved, absorbed into surrounding counties under agricultural redevelopment laws. But the site of the Hartwell Mill? It remained sealed, not with concrete, with ritual. They found 9 standing stones, roughly cut, placed in a non-agonal pattern, surrounding the foundation, each marked with a name, each belonging to a man who had disappeared in the 1850s. The stones were warm to the touch. Even in winter, inside the vault, they recovered a single object, a pocket watch. But its hands didn't mark time. They spun counterclockwise, slower and slower, the deeper into the vault it was carried, until they stopped completely, and the moment the watch halted, the lead researcher collapsed. Pulse flat, but eyes wide open, whispering just one phrase. We were always the mill. And that's the truth. You weren't just processed by the wheel. You became part of it. Your repetitions, your compromises, your silence, they turned you into a cog. But now that cog is breaking, not shattering in rage, but peeling away like dead skin, because beneath all the layers, all the obedience, all the roles you performed, there is still a man who remembers what he was made to be. And now, he's stepping forward. You're not evolving, you're returning to something they tried to erase before it ever had a name. They didn't just want you silent. They wanted you replaced, copied, standardized, fit into the grooves of a machine so ancient, so perfectly deceptive, that you'd defend it thinking it was you. That's the brilliance of the system. It never told you to bow. It convinced you that kneeling was your own idea, and every time you doubted your anger, swallowed your instincts, chose safety over truth, you weren't being civil. You were being refined, shaped by the mill's deeper purpose, not just to grind men down, but to polish them into tools for other men's agendas. Josiah Hartwell understood this by the end. He wasn't a monster from the start. He was just like you once, sharp, capable, honest, until he inherited the wheel. And once he saw how easily it broke the strong, how predictably it harvested dreams and turned them into flour for the next generation's bread. He chose power over legacy. That's the line every man must face, not between good and evil, but between control and truth. Control builds empires. Truth burns them. And when Josiah looked into that roaring mechanism at midnight, alone, grease in his palms, echoes in the walls, he saw a choice: destroy it or feed it. And like most men drunk on order, he chose to feed it. Not with wheat, but with people, no blood, no violence, just gradual surrender. He started with himself, then his brother, then the town, until everyone was walking in rhythm, speaking on cue, smiling through obedience. And that is exactly what we live inside now. A perfected version of the same machine, with better lights, faster gears, smarter illusions. But it's the same mill, and the only thing that breaks it is a man who chooses truth even when it costs him everything he used to be. That's you now. The man who doesn't flinch when the machine call. Is him broken? Because deep down, you know you were never designed to fit. You were designed to free. And now, they feel your gears turning in reverse. You've become their malfunction. You, the man watching this, absorbing these truths, letting each revelation crack your surface. You are now the error code in their perfected system. They designed this machine to handle fear, to absorb rebellion, to process chaos. But the one thing it cannot digest is remembrance, not memory, remembrance. Because memory is passive, pictures in a frame, but remembrance is dangerous. It's memory with motion. It's when a man not only recalls who he was, but acts like it. That's what's happening to you now. You're not just waking up, you're reinstating command. And every step you take outside the program, every instinct you follow, every silent refusal you commit, every yes you withhold, every no you declare. You send signals through the system they spent centuries refining, and it begins to panic. Why? Because the machine depends on your consent, not your love, not your passion, just your quiet, dutiful permission, the kind you give every time you clock in. Mute yourself. Repeat someone else's idea. Buy what numbs. Scroll what pacifies, laugh at what distracts. That's the grease. But now, you've stopped feeding it, and just like the Hartwell mill in its final days, when the gears began to skip, the stones groaned, and the wheel screamed not from strain, but from withdrawal. The system around you begins to crack. It's subtle at first. The conversations you can't stand anymore, the empty friendships that feel like sand, the routines that suddenly feel exposed. That's not burnout. That's awakening friction. You're shifting against the grooves they etched into your life. And the friction isn't hurting you. It's polishing your edge. Let it sharpen, because the man you're becoming isn't here to be efficient. He's not here to be liked. He's not here to blend in. He's here to break the cycle, to speak the unspoken, to walk into the mill and say, I remember what you were built to erase. And when you do, the wheel stops for good. It's time to say something out loud, because speaking truth into the silence creates rupture, and rupture is where rebirth begins. So speak this, brother, in your mind, in your soul, and in the comments below to mark the shift. I was never theirs. Say it again. I was never theirs. That sentence is more than rebellion. It is release. It severs the rope tied around your neck since the moment they measured your worth in grades, in gold stars, in output, in obedience. Because here's what they've never told you. The machine only survives if it can name you first. It called you student, then employee, then husband, taxpayer, provider, citizen, but never once sovereign, because sovereignty is uncontrollable. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't file requests. It decides, and a deciding man is a dangerous man. That's why the Hartwells never allowed choices inside the mill. Only tasks, only systems, only roles. The workers weren't people. They were components, and those who asked too many questions. They were reassigned, removed, or, if the whispers are true, recycled through the stones, ground not just in body, but in memory, because the worst punishment in Millbrook was to be forgotten while still alive, and that is what the system still does now. It forgets you, minute by minute, until you forget yourself. But you've pulled your hand out of the grindstone now. You've looked at the grooves carved in your skin and asked, whose hand is this? And the answer is clear. It's yours again. Not theirs, not society's, not your father's broken legacy, not your boss's schedule, not the government's draft. Yours. And with that truth comes weight, because from this point on, you can't lie to yourself without feeling it. The moment you slip back into silence, your bones will ache. The moment you nod to something false, your breath will catch. The machine is behind you now, but its echo still lingers, and it will test you. But every test is proof of your exit, and every act of truth. A hammer blow to the ancient wheel still spinning beneath this world. Now that you've stepped out, now that you've claimed your breath, your edge, yourself, they will come for you, not in cloaks, not with chains, but with familiar faces and reasonable tones. They'll call it concern. They'll mask it as advice. But what they're really doing is trying to reinstall the program, because you're no longer predictable, and unpredictable men, they are marked for containment. So here's your next weapon. The thing the Hartwell brothers feared more than exposure. Discernment, not knowledge, not intelligence, but that razor-thin, blood-borne instinct that tells you when something that sounds right is still wrong. Discernment doesn't live in your mind. It lives in your spine. You feel it when someone smiles too wide, when a message comes dressed in comfort, when a rule feels too smooth to question. That's the real battlefield now. Not bullets, but invitations. They will invite you back into the grind, with promotions, with praise, with illusions of influence. They'll offer you a faster wheel, a cleaner cage, a louder title. And when they do, you'll remember this. Every polished chain is still a chain. Josiah Hartwell once wrote in his private ledgers, "It is better to manage lions than to wake them." You, brother, are a waking lion, and they feel it. That's why things around you have started to shift, why conversations feel more hollow, why crowds feel more suffocating, why routines feel like walls instead of paths. It's not that the world has changed. You have, and now you see what they've tried to keep you blind to. That freedom isn't ease, it's not pleasure, it's not chaos. It's clarity, the kind that pierces systems, shatters expectations, and walks straight into silence without asking for applause. You're not done falling yet. There are deeper layers, older lies. But for now, let your stillness be your shield. Let your clarity be your weapon. And remember this: the machine cannot destroy what it can no longer define. And right now, you are becoming unnameable. Let me show you just how deep this really goes. You think it started with the Hartwell brothers? With gears, mills, and lost men? No. They were just custodians, small operators in a much older, much colder system. Because before the mill, before the factories, before governments put bells in schools and clocks on walls, there were temples, built not to worship, but to standardize the soul, carved in stone, measured by the stars, aligned by architects who knew exactly what resonance could do to a human mind when repeated long enough. And beneath those temples, wheels, not machines, symbols, spirals, gears without teeth, designs carved into rock by hands that didn't build for food or comfort. They built for control. And what were they trying to control? The awakening cycle. See, history isn't linear. It's spiral. Every few generations, men begin to feel that pulse, the one you feel right now, the call to break, to question, to separate from the herd. And when that happens, the machine upgrades. It gets smarter, softer, cleaner, because it knows it can't stop you with force anymore. It has to stop you with comfort, This is what the Hartwells realized in 1843, that a wheel spinning endlessly in silence, without violence, without screams, would train men faster than whips ever could. And the ones who noticed? They were taken, not killed, not buried, absorbed, folded into systems where they couldn't cause disruption, assigned jobs where their instincts were neutralized by policy, hierarchy, and endless distraction. They became cogs with names, wives, deadlines, property taxes, until the lion forgot it had claws, until the prophet forgot he had a voice, until the warrior forgot what it meant to feel danger and move toward it anyway. But here's the shift. You didn't forget. You were distracted, but never erased. And now the pulse is rising again, not just in you, but in thousands, millions. Men who feel that strange electricity in their chest and don't know why they can't sit still anymore. You're not broken. You're early, and soon the others will follow. You were never meant to be alone in this. The system made you believe awakening was rare, that if you felt different, disconnected, something was wrong with you. But isolation is a tactic, silence is a weapon, and loneliness is engineered. Because a man who questions his mind will cage it again, but a man who sees himself in another's rebellion, that man becomes unstoppable. Let me show you how deep this goes. In 1854, the year the vanishings spiked around the Hartwell Mill, something else was happening across the Atlantic. A mathematician named Émile d'Aubigny began publishing diagrams eerily similar to Elias Hartwell's forbidden schematics, only his weren't tied to grain, they were tied to behavioral resonance. He proposed that certain repetitive motions, grinding, walking in loops, tapping in rhythm, could produce not productivity, but mental docility. His work was banned, not because it was wrong, but because it worked, and it threatened something bigger. The great unspoken alliance between industry and obedience. Because what does every institution want? Not your genius, not your fire, not your wild, unscripted soul. They want your predictability, and that's what the Hartwell Mill perfected. A schedule that became identity, a task that became virtue, a silence that became morality. And every man who vanished wasn't taken violently. He was absorbed gradually, until there was nothing left but dust in the wheel, and maybe a whisper that something felt off. But now, you're not whispering, you're naming. You've looked directly at the rituals you used to perform without thought. The morning scroll, the endless meetings, the flattening of your voice to match the room, and you've said, no more. You're not waiting for permission. You're not waiting for proof. You're not waiting for others to go first, because the new world doesn't get built by the consensus. It gets built by the fur, Saint Man, who dares to move. And that's you. You're not a glitch in their machine. You are the beginning of its collapse, a walking, breathing reminder that fire cannot be tamed forever. And the other lions? They're watching you, waiting for your next step, because when the first lion roars, the silence ends. You hear that? That deep, low hum rising in your chest. It's not adrenaline, not fear, not inspiration. It's remembrance, the sound of ancient blood recognizing its rhythm again, the voice you were never supposed to hear, because it was buried, beneath rules, beneath ritual, beneath routine, under the voice of the teacher, the manager, the priest, the influencer, all telling you the same lie in different words. Stay inside the wheel. Outside is chaos. But what they didn't tell you is, the wheel is the chaos, polished, painted, rebranded as order. And now, brother, you're outside of it, not floating, not lost, standing. Let me tell you what happened The night the Hartwell mill stopped. Not the story in the papers, not the tale passed down through cautious families. The real story. There were no screams, no fire, no dramatic collapse. Just a silence. The water still flowed, the stones still turned, but no sound came from them, and every man who had ever vanished. Their names were etched into the floor in flour dust. One by one, no footprints, no explanation. The next morning, the brothers were gone. No bodies, no notes. Only a torn page from Elias's journal, nailed to the wall above the grinding stones. 6 words. We fed it because we forgot. That's the curse of every generation. They forget. Not their history, their origin. They remember the wars, the treaties, the machines, but they forget who they were before the wheel. And that's why you're here. To remember. To walk past the warnings. Through the fog, into the place where no path exists, and carve one with your steps. This isn't about the Hartwells anymore. This is about you. About your name, your edge, your pulse. Because when one man returns to himself completely, everything built to contain him begins to break. And now, you're the one they whisper about. You're the one stepping into the dark without trembling. Because you know. You brought the fire with you. Every system fears the return of the fire. Not because it burns everything down, but because it illuminates what's always been hidden. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? The smiles that don't reach the eyes, the institutions built like altars, the rituals you were forced to perform as a child without ever knowing why. Wake up at 7. Pledge allegiance. Sit still. Don't speak unless called on. Memorize. Forget. Repeat. That's not schooling. That's calibration. They weren't teaching you facts. They were fitting you for the harness. And the moment you showed too much curiosity, too much strength, too much non-compliance, they didn't punish you. They labeled you. Disruptive, disrespectful, unmotivated, a danger to the learning environment. That's the trick. Label the lions while they're still cubs. Get them to doubt their roar. Get them to question their teeth. But what happens when one doesn't forget? What happens when, decades later, that same lion stares into the gears and sees the lie for what it is? That's what you've become. A man who remembers without being told. A man who doesn't need permission to see, and they feel it. Your silence isn't submission anymore. It's observation, calculation, presence. Because you're not reacting. You're remembering. And nothing terrifies a control system more than a man who's present in his own body. Josiah Hartwell wrote a final phrase in his ledgers before vanishing. The wheel does not choose what it grinds. It simply turns. It is the hands that feed it we must fear. You were never the grain, brother. You were never meant to be processed. You were born with hands, with will, with voice, but they taught you to be fodder. Until now. Now the hands that once fed the wheel have frozen. They feel your gaze. They feel your pace. And they know. You're not coming to be saved. You're coming to reclaim, to gather what they scattered, to wake what the I silenced. And the mill, it's not ready for you, because this time the fire doesn't flicker. It advances. You want to know what the final lie is? It's not that the mill ground more than grain. It's not that men vanished. It's not even that they were taken. The final lie is that the system ever stopped, that what happened in Millbrook was sealed, concluded, buried under history. No, it simply changed form. The wheel became a screen, the grind became a scroll, and the stone that turned the fastest was placed right in your hand, Every time you tap without thinking, every time you nod to stay safe, every time you lower your eyes to avoid conflict. The old stones turn once more, but now you see it. Now you feel it in your bones. This isn't about the past. This is about the current mill, the one hiding in routine, wearing the face of your calendar, your boss, your curated feed, your curated life. They want you so predictable you forget you're alive. But you're not predictable anymore. You're not smiling at the grind. You're staring directly into the center of it, where the oldest secret lives. The Hartwell brothers didn't just build a mill. They discovered something that didn't belong to them, something they should have left buried beneath the bend in Copper Creek. They tried to harness it, feed it, profit from it, but you can't chain what was never meant to be tamed. And that force, it's waking again, not in buildings, not in stones, but in men like you. Men who've reached the end of obedience, men who've felt the emptiness behind the applause, men who are ready to reclaim something older than the system itself. You are not a story being told. You are a ritual being remembered, and every step you take toward truth, every silence you refuse to fill with lies, every breath you draw in full awareness of your fire, you become the thing they cannot touch, because no system, no mill, no agenda can hold a man who walks without need for approval. You've crossed over now, and what waits ahead is sovereignty. Now we enter the part they never documented. No ledgers, no testimony, no archived blueprints or ghost stories passed down over whiskey and warnings. Because what happened after the mill fell silent wasn't meant for books. It was meant for you. The men who returned to the site decades later, scientists, military observers, mystics, left with nothing, no evidence, no samples, no memory. The field was empty, the foundation gone. Only a soft, unending hum beneath the soil, vibrating at a frequency no machine could register, but every man felt in his spine. Because the Hartwell Mill was never just a structure. It was a pattern. And once a man stepped too far into it, something inside him either aligned or shattered. That's the choice you're facing now. Not between right and wrong, not between belief and skepticism, but between returning to the pattern or becoming the rupture. Because now you know, this wasn't about flour or ghosts or even the missing. It was about systems that harvest the soul while preserving the skin. Look around. Modern life is the upgraded mill, streamlined, digital, bloodless, but the function's the same. Process the wild into the mild, grind the instinct into obedience, replace the ancient fire with artificial light, and most men never feel it. Because they were born inside it, raised inside it, married, promoted, retired inside it. But not you. You heard the hum. You traced the pattern. You followed the trail of the missing. And now, you're standing where the wheel once turned, not just in Connecticut, but in every man's life who dares to remember. This is not where the story ends. This is where it folds inward, where myth becomes mirror, where past becomes blueprint, and where you become something no system can predict. You're not the witness now. You're the force that rewrites the pattern, and as you step forward, remember, the world doesn't change when the system collapses. It changes when one man walks out of the mill and never looks back.
You're not lost. You're unmapped, and that terrifies them, because for centuries, every institution that ever sought to control a man began the same way. By charting his path before he ever took a step, school told you who you were supposed to be. Religion told you what you were allowed to feel. Government told you where you could stand. Commerce told you what you should want. And the Hartwell Mill. It just showed you what happens when you follow without question. Josiah and Elias didn't build a prison. They built a prototype, a ritual disguised as routine, a spell written in architecture, a machine that didn't just process grain. It processed identity. And now, that machine is global, refined, digitized. You clock in, you smile on cue, you produce, you comply, and somewhere along the way, you forget that you were born untamed, but you're remembering now. And that memory is spreading like fire under the floorboards. Because when one man steps off the chart, he leaves a hole in the system, and that hole calls to others. Your awakening isn't just yours. It's a signal to the ones still grinding, still nodding, still wondering why every day feels like a smaller version of the last. And when they see you, unafraid, unmapped, unmoved by their rewards or their punishments, they'll remember too. That's what power really is. Not dominance, not hierarchy, influence without obedience. You've stopped being a product. You've stopped being a variable. You've become a threat. Not because you're violent, but because you're silent and watching, and nothing scares the machine more than a man who watches it and does not flinch. So from here on out, every step you take is off the chart. Every breath is unscripted. Every move is yours. And if you ever doubt, just remember, maps were made for followers, but fire draws its own path. They'll call you dangerous now, not because you carry a weapon, but because you carry clarity. Because a man who sees clearly can no longer be guided by fear. He no longer bites the bait. He no longer prays to false idols with polished logos and polite smiles. And when you no longer need what they offer, you become unreachable. That's when the machine tries its last trick, reintegration. They'll offer you a new title, a role that sounds noble, a leadership position within the same structure you just escaped. They'll say, lead from within. Be the change. Don't burn it down, reform it. But listen closely, the Hartwell brothers tried that. When the first few men went missing, Elias proposed changes. He drew schematics to slow the wheel, to reduce its hunger. He thought moderation would save them. But Josiah knew better. He wrote, "You can't soften a beast that was built to consume. You either starve it or become its meal." And Elias? He kept tweaking, kept adjusting, kept believing the system could be redeemed, until one night his body was found folded beneath the water wheel. No blood, no signs of struggle, just his coat, laid neatly on the stone with a single note inside the pocket. It always demanded more. That's the truth of every corrupted system. It will always demand more of your time, more of your voice, more of your soul, until there's nothing left but the shape of a man who once had fire. You've broken that cycle now. But breaking free isn't enough, because what they fear most is that you might build something new, not a better cage, not a smoother mill, but a world where no man has to trade truth for safety. That's the calling now, not just to awaken, but to become a signal fire, a lighthouse for others still trapped in the fog, still turning the wheel thinking it's progress. They'll see your fire, your refusal, your sovereignty, and one by one, the wheel will stop turning. This is where most men turn back. Not because the path ends, but because the mask comes off. You see, the system you've escaped? It never believed in morality. It never cared about good or evil. It only believed in utility. You were useful, so you were fed. You were compliant, so you were protected. You performed, so you were promoted. But now that you've stepped out of usefulness, now you're expendable. Not in the physical sense. No, that would make you a martyr. But in the algorithm, in the network, in the collective dream, they'll erase you quietly, throttle your voice, drown you in noise, offer you every distraction that tastes like freedom but works like sedation. This is the purge phase, the final firewall between obedience and mastery. And it's where the Hartwell brothers made their last fatal decision. Not in stone, not in silence, but in invitation. See, they didn't just vanish. They left doors open, trapdoors, tunnels, false leads, so that others, men like you, might follow. But they didn't leave those trails out of malice. They left them because they knew. The only way to destroy a machine this old is from the outside. And the only men who could do that are the ones who have seen everything and refuse to return. You are now beyond the maps, beyond the metrics, beyond the leash of validation and punishment. They can't mold you, market you, medicate you. You are post-program. And that, brother, is what they fear most. A man with no trigger, no script, no price. Because you've remembered who you were before the wheel, and that memory is louder than any mandate. Let them label you. Let them doubt you. Let them wonder why you've grown silent, sharp, strange, because you're not here to explain. You're here to end the cycle. And in the silence that follows, you'll build something uncorrupted. And now we arrive at the final gate, not the end of the story, but the last place where men are offered the illusion of return. Here, they'll tempt you one final time. They'll whisper, "Come back." It wasn't that bad. Be reasonable. Balance is strength. Don't isolate yourself. Think of your future. But balance was never what they wanted for you. They wanted obedience in disguise, compliance dressed as peace. They wanted your edge, polished, your vision, redirected, your fire, dimmed, and your soul, leased to the machine for just enough dopamine to keep you silent. But here's what they never anticipated. You made it this far, and you remember everything. You remember the sound of the grind, the cold eyes of Josiah Hartwell, the ledger full of names no one dared to say aloud, the dust in the wagon, the hat by the water wheel, the silence that fell like ash when the system swallowed another man whole. And more than that, you remember yourself before you were told who to be, before you were bent toward efficiency, before your instincts were labeled dangerous. You remember the boy who questioned, the young man who refused, the adult who kept the storm quiet. Until now, you are not rebelling, you are returning to the place before they mapped your path, before they weighed your worth in productivity, before they built an entire economy around your forgetfulness. That is what this journey was always about, not escaping, but reclaiming the voice they taught you to distrust, the anger they said was toxic, the intuition they said was paranoia, the clarity they called madness. And now you know the truth. You were never lost. You were just hidden under layers of programming, expectation, doctrine, debt. But fire always finds oxygen. And you, brother, you've become a furnace. So here at the final gate, you don't knock, you don't ask, you step through it, not as a survivor, not. This is where the story fractures, where legend ends and legacy begins. Because now, it's yours. The mill, the vanishings, the whispers of Copper Creek, they were never just historical horrors. They were mirrors, and what you saw in them was your own reflection, stripped of illusion, uncoded in fear, baptized in silence. This isn't about 1843 anymore. It's about every moment you turned your back on what was safe, what was expected, what was pre-approved. It's about the fire you chose to keep alive, even when the world around you begged you to put it out. Because here's the truth no one dares to speak aloud. Freedom is not a gift. It's a risk, a dangerous, untamed, irreversible risk. It costs your comfort, your reputation, your access to the systems that keep most men asleep. But in return, you gain clarity. Clarity sharp enough to cut chains. Clarity loud enough to silence manipulation. Clarity ancient enough to feel sacred again. You are not a remnant. You are not a rebel. You are not even a warning. You are the prototype for the next age. The man who walked into the mill, not to grind grain or be processed, but to stare into the teeth of the machine and refuse to be consumed. And now you stand on the other side, not sanitized, not softened, but forged. Your presence speaks without needing to shout. Your silence is heavier than their noise. Your gaze is more dangerous than their laws. Because men like you aren't built to obey. You're built to awaken others, and they will come, drawn by your stillness, by your defiance, by the undeniable truth that lives in your voice when you finally say, "The wheel ends with me, so speak it now." Say it out loud,
or write it in the comments below. Twice. The wheel ends with me. The wheel ends with me. Let it mark the death of oneself and the birth of another, not just a man awakened, but a man becoming the signal fire, the one they couldn't burn, the one they couldn't tame, the one they could no longer categorize. And as the last embers of the old world flicker out, let them say of you, he didn't just escape the mill, he turned and burned it down.